Alright, so the balance changes are out, and you're probably wondering if this fixed the problem. No. Hey, what is up YouTube? Kolst here, and we're going to be talking here because patch 25.0.4 just came out. I'm going to, as normal, give the arena update, and we got a lot to talk about, so let's just get right into it. Of course, I'm assuming you're familiar with the whole arena situation where Death Knight is, and the whole arena balance is in the worst situation any mode has ever been in ever. I have a whole video talking about that, but let's just get into these changes. So two main changes we're going to talk about here is there were a lot of balance changes to cards made for standard mainly, but also a lot of it's going to impact arena. But also there were arena changes made, which we'll talk about for most of the video, but let's just talk about these changes really fast. I'm actually going to blaze right through all of the nerfs because most of them, a lot of these cards aren't actually even in arena right now. And a lot of these changes honestly aren't even that important, so you know. Few of the Demon Hunter cards getting nerfed, Druid Legendary, Priest card, that one's significant when it comes back, but whatever, this card you never saw anyway. Draka's not really an arena card, same as that. That one's significant, I guess, but you know. Get the information wasn't really draftable, this card wasn't really draftable. Renathal actually was literally undraftable, and Tome Tampering was completely unplayable, so not that much of impact here. So let's talk about the buffs now, and all the buffs are being limited to one class, which we mentioned already once in this video, which is Death Knight, because Death Knight was not strong enough in Standard, so even though it was 62-63% win rate in Arena, getting a whole bunch of buffs. So we'll kind of go through these rather quickly as well. Corpse Bride now goes up to 10 corpses, so you can get a 5-mana 14-14 instead of only a 12-12, that wasn't good enough apparently. Malignant Horror went from 5 corpses spent to 4. We're going to be talking about this one a little bit later. Meat Grinder gained additional corpse, not that impactful. Blight Fang gained an additional stat because why? I don't like it. It just seems completely unnecessary, but okay. Stitch Giant loses a mana, so Deathbringer gains an additional attack stat. Rune Sculptor also gains an additional attack stat. Both of these are just kind of like, okay, they're just pushing them a little bit more for Constructed, I guess. They're already super good arena cards. Now they're, I guess, a little bit better. And Obliterate. Instead of taking damage equal to the main's health, you just always take 3 damage, which is a pretty significant thing, because if you were going to take 8-10 damage, now you're just not. But also if you're going to kill a peasant, now you take 2 extra damage. So it's not just a buff, keep in mind. And also Blood Tap loses 1 corpse on its spend requirement. Okay, so overall, a lot of these, you know, gaining an attack stat like that isn't super big, but, you know, the biggest changes here are the Obliterate one and the Malignant Horror one here, which, again, we're going to talk about a little bit later. So obviously, if you're coming up from the perspective of an arena player, you're a bit concerned that they are doing a whole bunch of these buffs, even though, I mean, most of them aren't going to matter, but a couple of them will, again, we'll get into that. But we also will talk about the other changes here, which were the arena changes. Arena draft appearance rates have been adjusted as follows. And I'm not going to go through all this because a lot of this is really vague, but basically they're nerfing Death Knight and Paladin, specifically cards that generate more cards and remove while leaving a board presence in Death Knight. And they're buffing a bunch of the low win rate classes as well via, if you're not familiar with how Blizzard does this stuff, is they basically, if they want to make a class better, they get more of their good cards and less of their bad cards. Or if they want to make a class worse, they get less of their good cards and more of their bad cards. Kind of makes sense, right? And another note here is that they are adjusting some neutral cards as well. I do believe that, I might not talk about this later, but they're basically talking about discovers, like spell discovers here. Those are the only ones I really noticed. I might have missed something, but that's what I noticed. And so with that, let's just actually look at the HS replay data to kind of show what's really changed. This is a very informative patch as far as that stuff, because they did actually make a pretty dramatic change here. So you can see better than normal exactly the impact of kind of the things they did. So let's just pull up these win rates here. So you can see this is the before and after on the left. This was the data exactly as of when the patch hit that I had screenshotted. And now on the right, this is how the data looks now. It was actually very convenient. Things have been moving around slightly, but Death Knight just barely hit 60% just in time for me to record this video to make it slightly more dramatic. Really nice of them to do that, because they had actually dipped below 60, but, you know, it doesn't really matter. The point is Death Knight is still, you know, hugely above every other class. It's convenient as well that things settled where there actually is only one above 50% win rate class. Every class that is not Death Knight is below 50%. And so specifically, as they said, Death Knight and Paladin were the ones nerfed. You can see both Death Knight and Paladin did go down. Paladin a lot more, which we'll break down a little bit about exactly what they changed, but then also, you know, a lot of the bad classes also went up. You can see the bottom 4 here, mainly Shaman, Druid, Hunter, Warrior. These classes all went up significantly. You will see that the bottom 9 classes all went up, but the middle 5 classes here actually were unadjusted as far as I can tell. They simply went up. They all went up by like about 4% simply because they're getting destroyed by Death Knights and Paladin less, basically. And so just looking at this, it's kind of funny. You almost would ask like, well, has the balance gotten better? In a sense, it hasn't, because, you know, the difference between number 1 and number 2 is just as big as it used to be. So Death Knight is still absolutely dominant. Still, this includes 50-50 matchups with Death Knights versus Death Knights. So that 60% really means something probably closer to 70-75% against all the other classes. That's something to keep in mind. So the game is still horribly imbalanced. However, you know, things are a lot closer than they used to be, especially if you were to ignore Death Knight, if you just pretend like it didn't exist. The balance is actually, you know, pretty good. It would probably be everything within a 55-45 range, which is what's considered, you know, acceptable by even internal Blizzard standards. So in a sense, they did a good job with the adjustments in that way. However, you know, you have this elephant in the room, which really isn't an elephant. It's like a giant woolly mammoth that, you know, turned into Godzilla type thing, which is Death Knight, just completely dominating everyone else. And the only other thing I wanted to say looking at this screen is, you know, as is kind of typical when they do this style of adjustments, the class that really benefited the most in this case was Shaman. Shaman just being the best class that was buffed. So Shaman all of a sudden moving up to number 3, could possibly even pass Warlock at number 2. We'll see. Things are pretty settled at this point, but things will still bounce around a little bit. Oh, and the other thing I wanted to talk about was that you can actually see a bit of a meta shift happening within these win rates here, because what's actually happening here is the classes particularly moving up a little bit more than you would have expected were Warlock and Shaman. And Shaman, as we'll talk about, has a bunch of survivability cards and a bunch of really good late game cards, which allows them to play a control strategy against Death Knight, which seems to be the way to beat Death Knight. And Warlock also, you know, having life tap, having a lot of mass board clears, some healing as well, also very good at playing control against Death Knight. So, you know, these two classes really doing well, because Warlock, for example, wasn't that far ahead of the field and is significantly above like Demon Hunter Mage compared to what they used to be. And Shaman as well, you know, really blew out a lot of the other classes that it was actually relatively close to. But with that, let's look at some of the win rates, because I do want to talk about this quite a bit, because you know, initially it might look like, because Death Knight only dropped by 2%, that not a lot was done to them, but this is actually very far from the case. They really did try to nerf Death Knight. They really tried. The thing is that, you know, it was just first of all, a lot of those buffs, particularly the Malignant Horror buff, which we'll talk about very soon, really helps Death Knight retain its advantage against the other classes. But also, as a result of the Paladin nerfs, Death Knight lost its greatest competition. You know, none of these classes are really, even after the changes, anywhere near where Paladin was. So even though Death Knight got weaker, it just doesn't have competition. So let's pull up some of these win rates here. I think the easiest way to see the changes that they did are to just look. Right now I'm looking at the last 3 days of data, and I'm just sorted by win rate. We're just going to be looking at the rarity of these cards and the percent of decks. Keep in mind that basically anything that is a common would be in like 40% of decks, but this is like Necrotic Mortician. This is the Discover. This is down to 8%. Army of the Dead, this thing was, I believe this was at like 30%. Now it's down to 7%. Vizier, I did mention they were actually nerfing Discovers as well. This was at like 27, I believe. They cut this in half roughly. Necromancer, way to get a bunch of annoying taunts, really far down as well. Plague Strike, about a third, I think, of what it used to be. Importer also got hit because of the spell discovers. Baron, the card draw, got hit. Malignant Horror, not hit, which we'll talk about again. But then even, you know, some of the, like the frost spells, like Remorseless Winter got hit. Frost Strike, because it's a Discover, got destroyed. One Guard Commander, this was one of the big win conditions for the red color. And there are just like a whole bunch of changes here. I think that's most of them, but yeah, like they hit a lot of cards. By the way, here's the red Discover as well. They really hit like a lot of cards. They even hit like Corpse Bride. Like they hit like at least, I want to say it was as close to 15 cards, and they really destroyed them. Like, Death Knight is significantly weaker in absolute power, but again, like, they lost their biggest competition in Paladin, so they're still right around 60% win rate overall right now, including all of the 50-50 mirror matchups. And as a result of that, if you do play Death Knight, it is going to feel worse because, you know, when you lose all of these class cards, they're going to get replaced by kind of bad neutrals. A lot of the cards from the old set. Death Knight actually does feel significantly worse to play right now as a result, but again, you're just still way better than everybody else. And a huge part of the reason for that, as I've been alluding to multiple times, is this card, Malignant Horror. This is by far the most common card to actually draft in Death Knight right now. Let's sort by the appearance rate here, and you can see, you know, it's in 60%, which is a really high number, by the way. We're going to be talking a little bit more about that, but yeah, like, there's other good cards, right? Like Accolade Death's another huge one if you have a single blue. Very impactful as well, but also among these super high appearance rate cards, Malignant Horror is the highest win rate. And I think I'm willing to say at this point, you know, this card is a real problem for Arena. It was a real oversight that they just didn't, you know, at least adjust this card down. Because now it was at like 50% index, now it's at 60% index. And I don't think it's... Part of that is because, you know, so many other cards are not showing up that everything got a little bit more common. But also people are just picking this every time they see it now because it is just the huge way you win as Death Knight now. If you're not familiar with this card, basically this is just a 4-drop that never dies. And it used to be 5 corpses, which was very significant. Because now with only 4 corpses, technically if you think about it, this thing is a minion with Reborn, and then it summons a copy of itself with Reborn, which means when all of that dies, that's 4 corpses. So this thing actually starts out being corpse neutral. It replaces itself. And in general, this thing is very likely to go off multiple times, and going off multiple times, you know, the difference between being -5, 10, 15 corpses versus being 4, 8, 12, it really becomes significant difference, means you end up eventually getting an additional copy you wouldn't have, which just makes it, you know, snowball out of control. And the other key thing with this is that people are just learning how to abuse this card a little bit better, because, you know, for example, you can give this thing Death Rattle with, you know, wherever the thing is, the 2-mana 2/2 that gives a zombie with Rush, you can give it Death Rattle, and the Death Rattle copies as well. You can do basically any buff to it, including any attack buff. If your opponent tries to, for example, ignore it and just hope you can't do anything, you can just Bone Marrow it and then you win automatically. Like, there's just, it's very difficult because it also, because it's so cheap on corpses, if you try to even partially clear it, because you can almost never fully clear it, if you try to partially clear it, they're just going to get to be able to summon another copy faster. It's just a complete nightmare. And so unfortunately we're in a situation where this card is really defining the entire meta right now, and this is just not really a fun card to play with in the arena. I mean, I'm at the point, I've been out of the habit and trying not to ask for bans, but honestly, I just want this card gone. I think this is an outright ban. I think this just needs to not be in arena personally. Or at least make it super, super uncommon so it's not, because it's the way that almost every Death Knight game ends, basically. It's really a problem. But with that, that's basically the story of Death Knight. They did really actually pretty significant nerfs, but essentially it wasn't good enough, partially because of this card. So let's talk about Paladin as well, because if you look at what cards they adjusted for Paladin, it wasn't nearly as significant. They did actually hit like Vizier as well. This used to be higher. But there were really only 3 main class cards that they hit from what I could see at least. I wasn't super thorough checking, but, you know, it was Flay of the Bronze, Bronze Explorer, both of the ways to discover dragons, and Alliance Bannerman. Through all of that, essentially, Paladin lost a whole lot of consistency. A lot of consistency of dragon discovers, but also, you know, value and draw via the Bannerman with also the hand buffs. Just basically made Paladin a whole lot less consistent. Paladin can definitely still high roll, but you know, Paladin's kind of down to that situation where if you don't high roll, it feels pretty bad for the most part. You can definitely play tempo with a lot of their divine shields and buffs that they have. It's not a completely dead class, but it's a lot weaker than it used to be. And so that's essentially why also, because Death Knight has a good hero power for dealing with divine shields, Paladin just lost all of its advantage that it kind of had towards, or at least not even advantage towards Death Knight, but just an ability to compete with Death Knight. They just aren't really there anymore unless you really, really high roll. And so that's it for Paladin. Let's just, I'm not going to look at all the classes all the other classes, the ones that weren't adjusted or the ones that were buffed. But just for example, one class that was buffed, let's look at Shaman, because for Shaman, it's just a little eye-opening to see just, you know, this is how hard they had to buff these classes to try to make them competitive. This is the one where they were kind of successful because Shaman, again, has a kind of good matchup, I think, against the Death Knight specifically, because they have the ability to create a lot of value and just have a lot of good late game. But you can see a lot of the cards that they really buff the rates of. These are shockingly high numbers, like 69% of decks, pretty nice, but also 1.6 copies per deck. You multiply that, that's 70% times more than 1.5. That's like 1.2 copies per deck. By the way, if you're confused, this number never goes below 1. This is, so the way you see how many cards there are per deck is to multiply these two numbers, essentially. But yeah, you have like more than one per deck. These are just like shockingly high numbers, right? The cards they have here, like survivability, value, removal, huge tempo, just pretty good cards, and they just have a whole lot of them. Normally 40% is around the top for these cards. So these are like, you know, this is like almost twice as much as cards usually appear. So there's a general problem in Arena when you do make cards this freaking common, and it's because, you know, at a certain point it starts to feel constructed because you're just going to assume, okay, they're a shaman, so they're gonna have these cards. And, you know, we come to Arena kind of to get away from that, right? So in this case, you know, they kind of had to do what they had to do to try to make other stuff competitive with Death Knight. But I do hope this isn't a trend, because you will start to hear the constructed light type arguments come out from a lot of people very soon, and people tend to be noisy about that. So I do think it's a problem, but again, they gotta do what they gotta do. Let's just look at one other class just for fun. Let's look at Warrior as well. Like, again, like they just like it's funny that it's mostly their weapons. They're not necessarily doing this to the best cards, because a lot of these cards are the ones with the offering bonus. But so Warrior just is getting thrown more weapons than they can actually use. It's just kind of funny to look at. And since we're here, I thought I would just show up, like I would show like Warlock as well, because how Warlock was moving up, and I just want to jump like between like last 3 days, last 14 days. There really isn't a lot of change here. These numbers are basically staying exactly the same. So just to show how they really didn't actually adjust the middle classes like Warlock. They just moved up because they're able to beat Death Knight a little bit more. So with that, I just wanted to take like one last look at the win rates here and just talk about, you know, kind of as a retrospective, like, was this a successful adjustment or not? As far as making the bottom classes and even most of the field slightly more competitive, they did get closer to Death Knight, not as much as you would have wanted, but, you know, they put themselves, as I talked about in the last video, in a very tough situation by having this wild rotation while a new class was coming out. There was just really no way, and there just remains to be no way that Death Knight can ever really be competitive when they just have so many better cards than everybody else, basically. But things are slightly less bad than they were, and also if you ignore Death Knight, the balance is actually pretty good in general for an Arena meta typically. However, it's going to kind of depend on what you really want in Arena. If you just want to play with the new class and you get offered the new class, this would be pretty enjoyable meta, because it's nice to just play the overpowered thing, I guess. But also, you know, we're in the same situation as before, essentially, where if they really wanted to make the game balanced and fair in that sense, really the best thing they could do would be to delete Death Knight. Or, which I know they won't do, and also what would I think would be the best solution, but I don't think they'll do as well, would be to just put Death Knight into its own pool, so they only queue into other Death Knights where everyone else gets to actually have, you know, a balanced and fun meta. Because I actually do find this meta pretty enjoyable up until you just lose to Death Knights, right? But when you're playing against within the other 10 classes, I think this meta is actually pretty nice. It's the only reason I still find it playable, really, because otherwise I just wouldn't be playing this game right now because of the Death Knight problem. And it's worth keeping in mind that this was, you know, this was the big Arena change and the big change for the Hearthstone in general before the holidays. So this is what we're stuck with for at least the next 2 weeks, maybe even next 3 weeks. So, you know, you gotta take it or leave it at this point. But it's nice in some sense that at least in some ways better. I've actually seen some complaints from people that, you know, Death Knight does feel significantly worse, and I've seen people complain that, well, now it's like, at least I could have fun with Death Knight before, but now I don't even feel like I'm having fun with Death Knight anymore, because 60% win rate isn't high enough apparently. But, you know, that is a point I've seen expressed as well. Overall though, kind of in hindsight or just retrospection, like, I think there are two main mistakes they made during this adjustment that I wish they would have done differently. Well, first of all, I wish they would have made this be the second adjustment. There's a reason I was so, you know, up in arms kind of they didn't do an adjustment before this. I knew that this adjustment would come, but I also knew that almost certainly it wouldn't be good enough So they needed to do, in my opinion, a first adjustment so that they could, you know, just have another iteration to make this a little bit more, put this a little bit more into a playable state, essentially. But in addition to that, there were two main, I think, tactical issues with this patch. Number one was that they, in my opinion, I would have actually sacrificed the balance in the low and middle parts to try to make it a little bit more competitive Death Knight. So basically, instead of only buffing the bottom 4 classes here, Shaman, Druid, Hunter, Warrior, I would have buffed everything except for Paladin. And that would have made the balance worse in the middle, but then, you know, we would have had classes actually, like Warlock definitely at positive win rate, and maybe even like Demon Hunter, Mage would have been positive win rate. And Death Knight would have been, you know, a little bit lower, or maybe down to like 57% or something. So it would have made it look a lot better. And there would have been more competition at the top, because, you know, the most important part is the top, because you always get to pick the best class you're offered. So you're usually offered one of the top 3. So that would have made the meta, in a practical sense, a lot more balanced as far as people actually trying to win. So that's what I would like to see personally. But the other change, you know, the big miss as far as adjusting Death Knight was the Malignant Horror miss as far as not adjusting that card down. Cards should have been nerfed by at least 50-75% offering rate, if not completely outright banned. The issue was, as I pull up this patch changes, I'm guessing that they might not have even known what these changes were going to be when they actually made the arena changes. I'm kind of curious if they didn't, because, you know, this card was like borderline a problem before, but now absolutely a problem. And again, like, I kind of just hope it gets banned outright, but at least, you know, completely nerfed in offering rate. But with that, I'm 30 minutes into my recording. I wanted this video to be short, but there was a lot to talk about, so thanks a lot for hanging out, everyone, if you made it this far. I should be streaming a decent amount this weekend. You can check me out on twitch.tv/Kolst. You'll see if I actually want to play how much arena I actually want to play with all of this, but maybe I might start playing a little bit more standard. I have been playing a little bit of Death Knight, and standard's pretty interesting. So, and oh yeah, the other thing I wanted to mention for people that have made it this far is if you want more live updates whenever any of these kind of, you know, whenever there's a release like this, a great place to do that would actually be to come to my Discord. I'll put a link in the description of this video, but, you know, I put like a whole bunch of discussion and just tracking a whole bunch of these win rates and stuff into here. So, and, you know, anyone can put whatever. I was like tracking back when it actually came out, when it was finally going to get to the point where Death Knight was above 60 and nobody else was below 50. We were like, whoa, we made it. This is the worst balance ever. It's really glorious. But yeah, definitely recommend if you're interested in that kind of stuff, because you know, obviously I can't realistically put out videos for every little thought I have every minute, but I do that a lot on my Discord, and also on my Twitter. I have a lot of that kind of stuff as well. Try to be a little bit more filtered on my Twitter, or at least maybe not filtered, but complain more loudly about the things that I think are worth complaining about, rather than just, you know, my knee-jerk responses to things. But yeah, anyway, that's about it. Thanks a lot for hanging out. We'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.